Westward expansion and the process of settling the American West began in 1850 and lasted until approximately 1890 as thousands of Americans migrated to the western regions of the United States. This migration and the changes that accompanied it had a significant impact on the land, the newly arriving settlers, and the Native Americans who inhabited the region prior to westward expansion. Before Europeans arrived in North America, the United States was inhabited by a variety of Native American tribes. These tribes were scattered throughout the country, and in many cases, the tribes moved throughout the regions that they inhabited as the weather changed and in the process of hunting and gathering food. Leading up to the Civil War from 1860 to 1865, Americans had expanded westward from the East Coast up to the region where the Mississippi River is through the center of the country. This left much of the western part of the United States, including the Great Plains, the American Southwest, and the Great Basin and West Coast of the United States, inhabited by the Native Americans. Following the conclusion of the Civil War in 1865, the migration of Americans expanded quickly as more and more people traveled west into these new regions of the country. Westward expansion occurred for three major reasons. The first reason was an idea known as manifest destiny. This idea, which developed shortly after the Civil War, led Americans to believe that it was their destiny and the nation's destiny to control all of the land between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Americans hoped to eliminate any European influence from the newly added areas of the United States and hoped to reduce the influence of Native Americans so that they could control more of the land and have access to the resources that were included. The land in the western part of the United States was full of a variety of resources that Americans started to trade with Native Americans. This led to the discovery of new minerals and resources such as gold, silver, and copper in the late 1840s and early 1850s, and led to a significant movement of people into the Great Basin and West Coast in search of these resources. In addition to the resources, the Great Plains provided valuable farmland and the opportunity for settlers to gain freedom, land ownership, and to make a living farming and selling crops. The Great Plains also provided other food sources such as buffalo, which provided food, and valuable pelts that could be sold for clothing and other textile-related industries. Finally, Americans hoped that westward expansion would reunite the nation following the division of the Civil War. Freed slaves could now leave plantations and the racism they were experiencing in the South and move into the free land in the plains. Many thought this would help relieve the tension from Reconstruction and the dissatisfaction of many in the South who thought they were being mistreated by the government of the United States for their involvement in the Civil War. The nation also felt a need to protect and define borders of the new states that had been gained during the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. After that war and the Gadsden Purchase, the United States acquired Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of Southern California that needed to now be protected and inhabited. These three causes drove the expansion and the movement of people west during the late 1800s. Prior to westward expansion, much of the west of the United States was inhabited by Native Americans. One of the largest groups of Native Americans was the Plains Indians. These Native Americans inhabited the region known as the Great Plains, which goes from the 98th meridian to the Rocky Mountains, and from the current day border of Canada all the way down into Texas. Much of this land is flat and level, it is treeless, and filled with grassland prairies, which could be easily cultivated and transformed into farmland. This land became very valuable to the new settlers who were hoping to acquire land of their own to homestead and farm. This land, however, was inhabited by a variety of Native American tribes, including the Apache, Comanche, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Pawnee, and one of the largest Plains Indians groups, the Sioux. These groups lived in the land but did not actually own it, and in many cases their survival depended on the hunting of buffalo and the gathering of food and other resources from the land. Many Native Americans hunted buffalo and would use the buffalo for food, shelter, and other tools, as you will see in the coming slide. As a result of the need and the essential use of buffalo to provide for themselves and their families, Native American tribes developed into formidable riders who had very good hunting skills and vowed to protect the land that they were living on. This land was viewed as sacred by the Native Americans because it provided them the resources they needed to live. And in many cases, they were willing to protect it and give their lives in order to defend their way of life. While they didn't own the land, they viewed it as sacred and something that they needed to protect. Following the Civil War, the Indian population in the West began to change. By this point, there were over 30 different tribal groups, but despite the large number of groups, the population of Native Americans was only around 225,000, or roughly 250,000 people. Native Americans hunted buffalo on the plains, originally by foot. However, as more and more settlers came to the West, they began to trade and gain horses and guns, which changed their way of life. Many of the Plains Indians became nomadic hunters who would move and travel following the herds of buffalo so that they could hunt as they needed more food and resources. This led to conflicts with other tribes, and the constant moving of tribes and communities forced the Native Americans to give up farming, making the buffalo, or Tatanka, an even more important part of their lives. Take a moment to watch this clip of a buffalo hunt from the movie Dances with Wolves. As you can see in the video, the buffalo hunt was an important part of tribal culture for Native Americans. While the men did the majority of the hunting, women and children also played a role in helping to collect the meat, hides, and other resources that came from the buffalo. The hunters themselves were highly respected, and the hunt was actually part of a religious experience for many Native American tribes throughout the Great Plains. As American settlers moved west, the introduction of horses and rifles made hunting more efficient and led to an easier time for Native Americans who relied on buffalo. As you can see in the quote at the bottom of the slide, Native Americans had a high level of respect for the buffalo and for the hunt. They used the animals for their houses and for their clothing by tanning the hides and turning them into leather used for teepees and other clothes. They also used the animal's skin for thread and for sewing their tents. They used the bones and the horns of the animal for tools such as awls and needles, and even in some cases burned the animal dung because there was no firewood on the Great Plains due to the lack of trees. They turned other parts of the buffalo, such as the stomach, into pitchers and vessels for carrying water, and rarely wasted any of the animal. They ate the meat, but they used the rest of the animal to help live their life. And buffalo were an essential part of life for the Plains Indians. As more and more settlers moved into the western areas of the United States, they began to make treaties with the Plains Indians in hope of avoiding conflict and gaining access to the land and resources that they were seeking. The Native Americans did not believe in individual ownership of land. Instead, their culture was based largely on community and communal land, sharing the land, using it, and migrating with the flow of animals as they moved throughout the area. This was in stark contrast to the miners and settlers who were coming to the area to claim the land and to use the resources and land that they would then eventually own. In order to gain access to the land, U.S. government officials negotiated a series of treaties with Native Americans, including the Treaty of Fort Laramie with the Northern Plains nations in Wyoming and Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota, as well as the treaty at Fort Atkinson in Nebraska. These treaties, in many cases, benefited the settlers significantly more than the Native Americans. In some cases, Native Americans were cheated from the land that they had inhabited and sold it to settlers without realizing they were giving up control of the land or giving up access to the land. And while the U.S. accepted Indian claims to much of the Great Plains, those claims were not always respected. Native Americans allowed the settlers to build forts, roads, and travel through their traditional tribal homelands, and this process resulted in a significant amount of damage to the land itself. While the United States agreed to pay for damages done to Indian tribal land, this did not always occur, and in many cases, Native Americans lost access and the resources that the land once provided their tribes. The loss of access and the ability to use the land, as well as the destruction of buffalo and the devastation of the buffalo population in the Great Plains, led to the largest conflicts between Native Americans and incoming settlers. One of the main reasons for this was that settlers did not view the buffalo in the same way that Native Americans did. In many instances, they hunted the buffalo solely for their hides so that they could collect the skin and turn it into leather, and disregarded much of the rest of the buffalo, as seen in this video from Dances with Wolves.
who would do such a thing. The field was proof enough that it was a people without value and without soul, with no regard for Sioux rights. The wagon tracks leading away left little doubt, and my heart sank as I knew it could only be white hunters. Voices that had been joyous all morning were now as silent as the dead buffalo left to rot in this valley, killed only for their tongues and the price of their hides.
While the introduction of horses and rifles helped Native Americans more efficiently hunt buffalo, they were even more impactful in the hunts conducted by settlers coming into the area. The efficiency of hunting with rifles and bullets as opposed to arrows led to a dramatic decline in the buffalo population of the plains. A population which had been roughly 15 million buffalo at the end of the Civil War in 1865 was reduced to less than 1,000 by 1886, making buffalo an extremely endangered species on the plains. This brought a significant disruption to the lives of the Native American tribes living in the plains, and when combined with the loss of access to land and the feelings of being cheated or manipulated by settlers and by the people making the treaties, Native Americans became extremely upset with the incoming settlers. This unrest would eventually manifest itself in a series of conflicts known as the Indian Wars that we will take a look at in a future lesson. As a whole, the migration of Americans west led to significant changes for both the settlers and the Native Americans. These changes often were a result of different goals and priorities for the settlers as opposed to the Native Americans, and the total combination led to dramatic changes for the land and people of the American West. We will continue looking at westward expansion with the development of mines and the railroad in future lessons.